I was honoured to be asked to speak today. Can I thank Standard Chartered for sponsoring the event? I'm going to start with a point and I'm going to illustrate with my own personal background very briefly. I suffered from dyslexia when I was at sort of junior school age. I'd largely mastered that, when I was about 13 or 14, by which time, for completely unrelated reasons, which no one understands, I started to go deaf. In those days, 1970s, 1980s, it was thought irresponsible to choose a career that exceeded your perceived limitations. I got into law by bluffing in interviews. I pretended I could hear when I couldn't. If I wasn't sure what was being said, I tried to design an answer that was good for all the possibilities that it might be in freewheel until I got the right one. I was rumbled on a number of occasions. People would say I thought there was something wrong, I thought there was something funny. Eventually, I succeeded, and I got in, I got a training contract. Of course, they were peeved to know that I hadn't disclosed my disability, but by the time they found that out, they could see I could do the job. Same thing when I qualified after my training contract. A lot of interviews didn't go well, but I was a bit deafer then, but better at feigning that I could hear and bluffing my way through. So I managed to get into Allen and Overy in, I think, 1984. Well, I was there for a while. I had to, at some point, late 1980s, I was approached and asked to produce medical reports to confirm I wasn't going any deafer, which obviously I was. I was a litigation solicitor, that's what I do fraud litigation. And as I'm sure many of you know, the answer you get to an expert's question very much lies in the question that's asked. So I was able to get 2 reports that said I wasn't likely to get any deafer from doctors, again, the same sort of bluffing and hunting around. I was made a partner in 1990. By mid-1990s, my hearing had declined so much that after one particularly disastrous meeting, I thought I'd have to give up. And I decided to give up law. I just couldn't see what else I could do. I thought I'd probably teach it, which I would have been terrible. Suddenly, within a matter of weeks, political correctness saved me. The political correctness movement hit the city and hit Allen and Overy. It then became inappropriate for people not to speak up for deaf people. People spoke up, people who said they didn't know when I could hear and when I couldn't, suddenly did know I couldn't hear, and I was able to do my job perfectly well. I left A&O for another firm in 1990, and I left that firm for my current firm in 2006, where things are fine. Why have I said all of that? Well, the point that I would make is that I'm only here by pure fluke. I have been able to get past the interview process simply because I was able to bluff. My hearing had not declined sufficiently for me to fail the interview. When I got in, I always had the chance to prove I could do the job before the opportunity was denied me in interview. It's the first thing I'd say. The second thing I'd have to say, being absolutely honest with you, it's been deeply unpleasant. It's not nice deceiving people in interviews in order to get a job. I only did it because I couldn't think of anything else I could do other than law. It's a very unpleasant feeling, it's very undignified, and it's rather shameful having to come to your colleagues, or not come to them, they come to you, and say maybe you should have disclosed your deafness at interview. I'm here in place of people whose hearing has been just that little bit worse at the same stage in their careers, or very much to their credit, weren't prepared to do what I did in order to get myself a career in law. Okay, so on to the subject matter of the day. Disability is a desirable disadvantage. Here I am. I'm now operating as a city lawyer. I'm competing with other law firms in the city, of which you'll all know, the sort of Freshfields, Links, people like that, other law firms in other jurisdictions to get work. I'm profoundly deaf. It is a very serious disadvantage. Let's not pretend it isn't. How am I doing that? There has to be some sort of explanation. Well, the way you would approach that problem depends upon very frequently your experience. If you're non-disabled, you might be more amenable to the answer, well, I'm doing it despite my disability. If you're disabled, you would tend to look at it, I'm doing it in a large measure because of my disability. My disability has taught me other skills. Now, the skills that you learn with your disability are disability specific. So let me just focus on two that I think relate to most disabilities. First, I think it really comes from an experience related to sensory and mobility disabilities. Living with a disability is like wading through treacle. To quote the Roger Daltrey song, the simple things in life are all complicated. Ordering a meal, getting a train ticket from a kiosk, getting new contact lenses, recent experience of that one. I don't know, trying to get yourself a cup of coffee in Starbucks, asking directions. These are all, for various reasons, quite long, fraught processes where you have to develop quite significant patience. Now, that is quite important, I think, because disabled people, people with disabilities, for many of them, tenacity, perseverance becomes instinctive. It's a lifestyle pattern. If you look at the other side of the coin, if you look at research on infant prodigies, what's fascinating about that research is how few people who are infant prodigies actually do fulfill their promise in later life. Why is that? Well, one of the most popular theories is because they haven't had the chance to learn skills by battling adversity at an early age. It's odd, isn't it? If you look at someone who happily puts down that they've done the Duke of Edinburgh Award on their CV when they leave school, you wouldn't need an explanation for why they do that. What they're saying is, I've dealt with adversity. Yeah? All I'm saying to you is, it's the same thing. It leads to a second skill, slightly more subtle perhaps. Being disabled in an environment where most people aren't, or a profession where most people aren't, gives you a unique set of problems to solve, and you're the only one there to solve them. How do you chair a conference of 250 lawyers when you can't hear what any of them are saying? How do you comment on a document that's just been handed to you or cross-examine on it in court when you can't read it? Yeah. These are unique problems. It's not just that you have to learn to solve them on your own. You also need the courage to do it. How many people would fancy being in front of 250 of their colleagues and being in a position where they had to chair the conference, for example? It does require an element of drive and courage. These problems are so specific to you that you don't get to be part of the crowd. You're living an inner life that isn't anyone else's. So there really isn't a crowd for you to join. That means that you can see the comfort that other people get from being part of a group. I see it. Disabled people tend to see it, but they don't usually feel it. But why is that relevant? Let me give you a truism. The greatest advances in any corporate area or any area or field of endeavour at all are always made by people who don't think the same as everyone else. That's truism, but it goes a bit beyond that. To illustrate why it goes beyond it, the story about a doctor in Vienna in the mid-19th century. Most of us owe our lives to him. In Vienna, there was a doctor who made a breakthrough discovery. He discovered that getting students to wash their hands, having done a post-mortem examination before examining patients with lesions, saved scores of lives, scores of them. Massive breakthrough after literally 2,000 years of thinking that diseases were passed by miasms. It was the forerunner of Pasteur and the germ theory. The evidence was absolutely conclusive, but the medical profession rejected him completely. That hostility to people who have unconventional thought is called Semmelweis effect. It's named after that doctor, Ignaz Semmelweis. Now, all companies claim, all organisations claim that they are receptive to innovative, original thought. But the research shows, in fact, that unconsciously they tend to reject it. I have personal experience of this, because I've been involved in litigation in frauds in the city now for around 20 or 30 years. And there was a huge element of those frauds that either permits them to take place or is involved in their actual perpetration, where people regard themselves as team players. They have a sort of cohort effect, groupthink it's called by psychologists. They take comfort in the safety of numbers. Now, many of those frauds, from Madoff to solo industries to libel, those would have been prevented if one person had stood up and said, this is wrong. We just need one. All the research shows just one person to stand up who's not part of that crowd. People find it difficult to do it. What I'm suggesting to you is that outsiders or outliers have a very important role to play if only corporate environments will accept them into it. So, let me recap. What am I saying? Am I saying that all disabled people are more tenacious and courageous than non-disabled people? No, I'm not saying anything remotely like that. I don't put it anywhere near as high. What I'm saying to you is that living with a disability is a unique experience. And when you interview someone who's disabled, how they've coped with that experience, how they've adapted to it, how they've conquered it, is a very important line of inquiry for you as employers to determine what their skill set is. Well, if disabled people have these skills, and if this is how they think, why aren't there more in the city? Well, I'm afraid this isn't rocket science, though it always takes people a bit by surprise. Take April Chambers. I don't know if any of you know who April Chambers is. She recently defended her organisation saying they weren't racist. April Chambers is chapter secretary of the South Georgia Ku Klux Klan. Now, many people might take issue with her view that she's not a racist. How is she blind to her own prejudice? It's called Dunning-Kruger effect. If you look at most skills, they can be put into two groups, or you can put them on a spectrum. Take one end of the spectrum. I can throw a javelin, and I can know I'm a bad javelin thrower without knowing how to throw it well. I just see the javelin lands far shorter than everybody else's javelin. Yeah? But for some skills, judging and doing overlap almost completely. The ability to construct a logical argument is an ability one can't have unless one can judge and recognise a logical argument. So it is with prejudice. That's why the first thing you learn when you have any, I'm sure it's the case for other minorities, if you have a disability, is that no one ever regards themselves or describes themselves as prejudiced. They're realists. That's what they think. Let's go back to April Chambers. April Chambers' racism revolves around fear and hatred. The second thing you learn with a disability is that prejudice revolves around patronage. You know, according to the stereotype, disabled people are weak. They need decisions being made for them. They need even a language, quite well-intentioned language, is one of support rather than facilities. People will make decisions for them. I will have had quite recent stages of my career, people wanting to phone up other people before I spoke to them to explain that Robert's deaf and all of this sort of stuff. I've 30 years experience, more than, in explaining to people I'm deaf, that this is someone who's done it for the first time. They think somehow they're in a better position to handle that situation. Now, if you live with a disability, you get to see this very, very quickly. On an intuitive level, if you look at the way the city markets its disability policies at the moment, it's all about declaring we're not prejudiced. It's all about telling them that they will not be discriminated against on their work floor. Of course, they hear all of this all the time. They just switch off. And from when I speak at universities to students, it's a recruiter speaking before me. And I'm often stunned at how blind they are to how badly they're going down. Because what they're doing is telling them, if you join us, you will be well treated. They've heard it all before. For anyone who deals with a disability, you have a set pattern with most conversations with strangers, and you get to be quite good at learning how that pattern is going to end up. How am I doing for time? Right, 2 minutes. If you want to attract disabled staff, the way to do it is not to focus overtly, and unfortunately it is now pretty much solely on recruitment. You have to look at how disabled staff are treated in the workplace. I'm not talking about basic things like wheelchair ramps. I'm talking about reassuring them that they won't, as most people in my own profession are with disabilities, be sidelined into non-fee earning jobs. Reassure them that their disability won't be seen as their salient feature. They'll just be lawyers like everybody else, allowed to get on with their jobs. That is really important. What I'm struck at the moment by in the diversity market is how everybody's very interested in getting credentials, logos emblazoned on their websites that they're disability friendly. But if you actually look and see what interest they have in, for example, working with charities, there are many, but like mine, we introduce mentors, we train people for free in disability etiquette. They're not interested in that. What they want to do is to get their numbers up. And whilst we still have that emphasis on superficiality, we will never succeed. Why won't we succeed? Because we are underestimating the powers of perception of the disabled people who might otherwise join. We cannot regard disability as a desirable disadvantage and at the same time underestimate these people in that way. That's all I have to say. Thank you very much.